Let's talk about John Rawls's theory of justice in a little bit more depth. So, as you probably gathered, the basic goal of Rawls's book is to answer the following question. What is the most appropriate conception of justice for specifying the fair terms of cooperation between citizens regarded as free and equal? Now, for Rawls, the question of justice concerns primarily what he calls the basic structure of society, or sometimes called the background institutions of society. Now, this is different from a lot of the other authors we've read who think about the justice of individual actions, like Socrates, who will ask about what the just man is like, what the just man does, as opposed to the unjust man, and many other people, including many people today, who think about the justice of individual laws or individual actions. Rawls introduces this term social justice to refer to the justice of the background institutions, to the justice of society writ large, or you might even call it macro justice. Now, the basic structure is the set of social institutions, like government, but also the family, religious institutions, culture, and so on and so forth, that ends up affecting the distribution of rights and duties in society, as well as the opportunities that individuals have to succeed or fail in their societies. This basic structure influences our life chances by making the kinds of inequalities that tend to arise in life either especially burdensome or not too terribly painful for the individuals concerned. Let me give you an example. In some societies, being born blind might be a quasi-death sentence. I'm thinking of places like ancient Sparta, where they would expose babies to exposure and would try to only raise those who they thought had a good chance of making it to adulthood, hale and whole. But in other societies, being born blind might still lead to a very rewarding and productive life. The blindness itself is not what ends up mattering. Rawls would say that's arbitrary from a moral point of view. It's how the background institutions treat that blindness that matters, morally speaking. So, for Rawls, the principles of social justice only apply directly to the basic structure, and only very indirectly to policies. Let me give you an example of how that might work out. So, in a modern society, if churches and families are very supportive of the blind, you may not need a very extensive social policy for the blind and disabled. If churches and families treat blindness like some curse or some disease, then you may need some very active social policy to help blind people get the full value of their liberties. So the degree to which society as a whole treats blindness, the way different parts of the background structure or the basic institutions of society treat blindness will affect whether social policy is necessary or not. And the evaluation of justice only applies to the complex interactions of all these different kinds of social institutions, including, of course, the government, but, of course, including also civil society, the private sector, and so on and so forth. Now, so we said that social justice, unlike other kinds of justice, is looking at questions of justice from the perspective of the basic structure of society. But social justice has another interesting feature that makes it really social. If you were to ask what justifies my being free to buy this big screen TV rather than to give money to the homeless shelter or a battered women's organization, Rawls would answer, because the background institutions are just. In other words, what gives you title to what you have is that everybody else, in some sense, is already adequately taken care of from the point of view of the principles of justice. And if they're not already taken care of, then in fact you aren't free to do whatever you want with your big screen TV, because that money may need, on grounds of justice, to be spent elsewhere. So the flip side of this view is that if some people aren't getting the full value of their liberties, which I think is roughly what social justice turns out to mean for Rawls, then we can't be confident that ours are legitimate either. So an unjust society does not only affect those on the receiving end of the injustice, But on the social justice view, things like pervasive racism affect us all. If the opportunities that one group has are not what they should be, that calls into question the legitimacy of everybody's opportunities and lifestyle. So in that sense, justice affects us all. It gives us a reason to care about how others are doing, because ultimately how they are doing affects, in some sense, what we are entitled to do with our resources and with our holdings. So, on a social justice view, everybody's standing in society and status in society is interconnected in a way. Whereas I think on other views of justice, and I think Socrates here epitomizes a very different tradition in political thought, on other views, what really matters is what you do yourself, not what other people do. What matters is, did you commit injustice? What matters is, did you do as much as you can? And if that's the case, then you have acted justly. And it's not that Rawls denies this, but Rawls wants to say the scope of justice is larger than this. It can't just focus on micro questions affecting the individual and small numbers of people, because at the end of the day, our rights, liberties, and opportunities, how well we do in life, and how good our opportunities are to do well in life, are affected by macro social processes, complex interactions of government, business, and civil society. Now, Rawls both has a method of thinking about justice, and he thinks that's the right way to understand justice, and he has two major principles of justice that he thinks derive directly from this method. I think it's important to distinguish the method from the output of the method, so to speak. And I think you could agree with Rawls, for instance, that the original position is a convenient and ingenious device to figure out what the principles of justice might be, and you might disagree with the way he interprets what the original position requires. Conversely, you might think that Rawls's general approach to what counts as just and social justice, he gets the right principles in the end, but you might be skeptical that principles of justice are the sorts of things that can be derived from a fair bargain with abstract contractors, and so on and so forth. So, the reasoning from the original position is what leads to Rawls's two principles of justice. He calls these the principle of equal liberty and the difference principle. But you could agree with the principle of equal liberty and the difference principle and disagree with his method of getting there. You could agree with his method but disagree about what that entails. And of course you could disagree with both or agree with both. But just to point out that the two aren't necessarily wedded to one another, because there's a lot of argumentation that takes place between the method and the output. So let's talk about the method. Rawls's method is to think about justice not as an internal objective set of truths, but as a set of moral principles that rational and reasonable people would agree to in a fair bargain. And to figure out what principles of justice society should adopt, then, we need to use our imagination in order to figure out what a fair bargain might look like. And again, it's only going to be by the use of our imagination that we can discover what the appropriate principles of justice for human beings are, because actual people in actual bargains are going to be biased in all kinds of ways that would make the outcomes of those bargains rather unjust. And this is Rawls's critique of social contract theory, of Locke and Hobbes, and so on and so forth, is that Locke and Hobbes are, at the end of the day, conceding that the bargainers are imperfect beings and are going to be aware of all kinds of facts about themselves and facts about society that are ultimately going to bias their bargaining in ways that will make the result of the bargaining not just. So his method involves his method involves figuring out what rational and reasonable people would figure out under ideal bargaining situations. In other words, what does a fair bargain look like? And in order to simulate this fair bargain, he uses the device of the original position. Now, the original position is a hypothetical bargaining situation. It's not an actual situation. It's not actual people. It's something that we're trying to imagine, where free and equal rational persons who have no idea whatsoever of their future position in society or their natural talents and abilities meet to bargain over what principles of justice to adopt for real society. The participants are said to be behind a veil of ignorance, and this veil of ignorance is important because it's what makes the bargain fair. They don't know anything about themselves, and so they can't use what Rawls calls morally arbitrary or irrelevant features about their talents or their personalities to bias their position as they make their decision in the original position. In other words, the veil of ignorance is what keeps the original position fair by making these hypothetical contractors unaware of where they're going to end up in society, what their skin color is going to be, what their race is, what their race is going to be, what their gender is going to be, what their parents' income is going to be, what their natural talents are going to be, and so on and so forth. Right. Now, in fairness, it sounds like there's a bargain here going on, but if you think about it, all these bargainers are identical. You could just imagine the original position as being a single person, imagining what social rules might look like if we remove the influence of morally arbitrary factors. But I think Rawls wants to take advantage of the idea of a bargain because so many people think of justice in the framework of a social contract theory. They think that ultimately what makes something just is the fact that it's the product of a bargain. So he wants to make his original position look like a kind of social contract theory, but in many ways it's not at all like a social contract theory. For example, in a voluntary agreement, people can leave or decide not to bargain, and that's not the case in Rawls's view. All the contractors have to come up with something. In fact, there's a way that Rawls really inspires himself from Kant. Now, you guys haven't probably read Kant, but Kant thinks that you can't really justly refuse to join a state. That is to say, you can't be reasonable and stay outside a state. And in part, that's because people who are outside of state for Kant and Rawls are threats to one another. Right? It's only within a state, that is to say, once you acquire an arbiter, once you acquire a police force that can keep people in check, that you are no longer a threat to someone else. And if you do not have a police force keeping you in check, then you are ipso facto a threat on this view. And since you don't have a right to be a threat for other people, you are morally obligated to join a state. Okay. So with that said, Rawls is very concerned about two possible sources of moral arbitrariness, two kinds of morally arbitrary features about individuals in society. He's worried about inequalities that stem from environmental advantages that people have. Right? So some people are born into rich families and some people are born into poor families, and it's not clear to Rawls why anybody born in a rich family should receive any particular advantages because of the fact they're born into a rich family. Similarly, it's not clear to him why anybody should receive any disadvantages because they happen to be born in a poor society. A second kind of inequality that he's worried about is inequalities in natural talent. That is to say, it's not clear to him why anybody should suffer or be advantaged by the random genetic lottery that we're all subjected to. Some people are born with deep disabilities, other people are born with fantastic assets, none of which they can said to have earned or in any sense deserve, Rawls thinks. And it's because these inequalities are undeserved and unearned, and because they affect people's life chances, he thinks the effects of these inequalities in some ways need to be blunted or even eliminated. Right? These features about us, our race, our natural talents, our parents' income, are arbitrary from a moral point of view. He thinks they shouldn't matter. They are not moral features about us. The only thing that can matter morally it has to do with the things we choose. So, like gender and race, in a perfectly just society, things that are arbitrary from a moral point of view should not have any independent effect on our chances of living a good life. They're morally irrelevant. So for Rawls, the rewards and penalties we receive from society should only be those that ultimately flow from morally relevant features about ourselves, like, as I said earlier, our choices. So, given this setup of individuals who don't know where they're going to be in society. They don't know what their position is going to be, whether they're going to be rich or poor. They don't know whether they're going to be black or white. They don't know if they're going to be male or female. They don't know if they're going to be talented or untalented or disabled. They get together in this original position and they have to do some bargaining. But what are they trying to bargain for? Well, for Rawls, bargainers have to conceive of society as a cooperative venture for mutual advantage. So these bargainers are rational and self-interested, although they don't know really much about their own interests because they don't know much about themselves. But they have to see society not as a zero-sum game, but as a mechanism through which cooperation yields them greater gains than non-cooperation. And the basic idea here, I think, is simple. It's as old as political theory itself, and indeed is been expressed by Hobbes, perhaps, most poignantly, and that's the idea that social cooperation through politics creates a surplus of wealth above and beyond what could be achieved with anarchy. That is to say that if people do not cooperate and do not participate in society, then you will have a kind of state of nature. And in that state of nature, people will be far too worried about defending their possessions or attacking other people's possessions to produce and ultimately live good lives for themselves. Indeed, the lives are likely to be not that nice. Or at least that, I think, is Rawls' assumption, and I think here he follows Hobbes pretty closely. So, politics, in a way, is... politics is a way of cooperating together to produce more wealth as well as other goods that we all want, but we can't get under a situation of anarchy. So security, freedom, happiness, and so on and so forth. And since we can't get that on our own under conditions of anarchy, we have very good incentives to come together to set up rules of social cooperation that are mutually advantageous. And they have to be mutually advantageous because people are assumed to be free and equal. They don't know what religion they are. They don't know what their interests are going to be. They don't know if they're going to be the sort of person who wants to go hiking every day or stay at home and play Xbox. They don't know anything about themselves in that way, but they know in some sense that there will be people in society who like to play Xbox. There will be people in society who like to go hiking. There will be people in society who are deeply religious and may reject lots of sort of mainstream culture. And they know that society will have to accommodate all these people, but they don't know whether they're going to be the religious person or the guy who likes to play Xbox. And so, as a result, they have to come up with some rules that are fair to everyone, and Rawls would call those rules just. Okay, so the idea is we all have to cooperate in order to secure the things we want. And so politics has to be in part the way of distributing the profits of the social cooperation. So we have certain interests in common, but of course we have a conflict of interest about what to do with these profits. How do we settle that conflict in a fair way? Well, we can settle it by trying to settle it before we know who's going to have what position in society. So again, this idea of a fair bargain is one where we're going to have to divide the spoils, so to speak, before we know who we are, and in some sense before perhaps we even know what the spoils are. That way, Rawls thinks, things will be as fair as they can be. So, ultimately, and again, after much argument that I'm not going to go into in depth right now, ultimately he comes up with two principles that he thinks that fair bargainers would choose in the original position behind the veil of ignorance. The two principles are the principle of equal liberty and the difference principle. Let's talk about both of these in turn. The principle of equal liberty. Each person, for Rawls, has an equal right to a fully adequate scheme of equal basic liberties, which is compatible with a similar scheme of liberties for all. So, Rawls thinks you don't know who you're going to be. You don't know if you're going to be a Hasidic Jew or if you are going to be an Orthodox Catholic. You don't know if you are going to be a secular humanist. You don't know who you're going to be, so your best bet, not knowing this, is guaranteeing religious liberty to everyone, he thinks. And so everybody gets a fully adequate scheme of equal liberties compatible with a scheme of liberties for all. So you get as much freedom of religion as you can get compatible with the freedom of religion of other people. I think this reflects the idea that bargainers behind the veil of ignorance know that they're going to have a life to live, but don't know which life they're going to have to live, and so they would rationally reject the notion that some must be sacrificed for the sakes of others, because they don't know if they're going to be the ones to be sacrificed. There's a real risk that if they adopt some sort of utilitarian principle, that their interests will end up being sacrificed for the interest of others, perhaps a larger number, and Rawls thinks that if you are in the original position, you could not rationally will that. You could not wish that your interests be sacrificed for the sake of others, because you know that you will have a life to live, and your job is to defend your interests, even though you don't know what your interests are going to be. But you know you will have some, and therefore you will want to defend the fact that you have interests. So they also, as we know, see society as a cooperative venture for mutual gain, and so they recognize that if there's nothing in it for others, they cannot secure each other's cooperation, right? So they know, in some sense, reciprocally, that they each are going to have lives to live. They're going to be different lives, and they're going to have to secure each other's cooperation. So they're going to have to give and take. They're going to have to give some to get some, so to speak. And so that's why Rawls thinks equal liberty, at the end of the day, would be chosen in a fair bargain. The second principle, and in fairness, this is the one that people argue most about, is called the difference principle. Occasionally the Maximin principle, but typically the difference principle. In the difference principle, social and economic inequalities have to satisfy two basic conditions. First, they must be attached to offices and positions open to all under conditions of fair equality of opportunity. And second, they must be to the greatest benefit to the least advantaged members of society. The first part of the principle is secured by the veil of ignorance. That is to say, the veil of ignorance means that since we don't know who is going to be competing for these positions, everybody would agree that people should have a fair, equal opportunity to achieve offices and positions that convey social status. And because society is a cooperative venture for mutual gain, nobody would want to be any less well off than they have to be, right? So the idea is everybody would try to secure the best deal possible for themselves, and the best deal possible is compatible with inequality as long as that inequality benefits the least well off, right? So whatever inequalities, social and economic in particular inequalities, arise in society have to be to the benefit of the least well-off in society. That is to say, there's no alternate principle of distribution that can regulate society that could produce a better outcome for the least well-off in society. So as I said, this principle is often called Maximin. And again, the key here is that bargainers don't know whether they're going to be rich or poor. And Rawls thinks that a rational person is just not going to gamble. He's not going to gamble that he might end up being poor, and because poverty is not going to be conducive to him defending his interests and pursuing his interests in life. And so, like I said earlier, by maximizing the position of the least well-off members of society, a bargainer is going to ensure that he will be as well-off as he can be, given his current ignorance. What this means is that, in some sense, the principle helps give value to the equal liberties that the first principle establishes. That is to say, we all have to have maximum equal liberty, but that equal liberty is not going to be that valuable unless we have the means to exercise it. And Rawls's difference principle is there to try and make sure that everybody's liberty has some worth to it, or as much worth as can be reasonably expected. What does it mean to have the liberties have value? Well, just imagine, for instance, a trivial liberty like the liberty to buy a car. Liberty to buy a car is valuable, of course, if you have the means to buy a car. But if you don't have the means to buy a car and you will never get the means to buy a car, it's not clear how valuable the freedom to buy a car is for you, right? And so the idea is that whatever kinds of liberties we are maximizing the equal liberty of, everybody has some interest in having a fair chance of having those opportunities if they want to exercise them. So it might not be the case that the person who wants to buy a car, but the idea is that, without knowing whether he wants to buy a car or not, this person's probably going to want to keep his or her options open. And so as a result, they want those liberties to be worth something and not just be paper liberties. That is to say that if you want to buy a car, you ought to be able to live the sort of life where buying a car is an option. If you want to, whatever it is your plan of life is, whatever it is that you want to do, you ought to have a chance to cultivate, you ought to have an opportunity to become the sort of person who is capable of enjoying that liberty. It doesn't mean that everything has to be given to you, it just means that you have to have a fair opportunity to get there, if it's at all possible. Now, this is where lots of disagreement arises about Rawls. It's worth noting that a lot of academic ink has been spilled trying to figure out how much inequality Rawls' view can tolerate. So because some people are going to be more productive than others, and they're going to be incentivized to be more productive by rewarding their talents, then it's not likely that absolute economic equality is going to be required by Rawls' view. And Rawls certainly doesn't intend his difference principle to apply to every single transaction that people could make, or even every single piece of legislation that people could make. But it's got to apply to the background institutions, and so as a result, it's very hard to infer actual policies for it. It's very hard to tell in practice where the least well-off folks in society are as well-off as they could be. Because we could always imagine a single law redistributing stuff from the rich to the poor, but we don't necessarily know what the long-term effects of that law will be on the fate of the poor, because of course that law may have incentive effects that reduce wealth creation in the long run, and so you might be getting fewer poor people now, but more poor people later. And so, for Rawls, you would have to try to figure out which balance of laws gives people the best long-run chance at being as well off as they can be. Okay, and of course for America today, lots of ink has been spilled trying to figure out what kinds of policies Rawls would endorse. Now, there were the policies that Rawls did endorse, writing in the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. Rawls definitely had a chance to talk about what he meant. And it certainly meant, for him, moving America in the more social democratic direction. He thought that government should do a whole lot more to benefit the least well-off in society in America, because he thought that, at the end of the day, the disincentive effects of taxing, say, the rich weren't that strong. But of course, the answer is going to depend a lot on what you think the major causes of objectionable inequality are. Because of course, if you think that inequalities are coming from, are coming from natural, well, if you think they're coming from natural endowments, but if you think that it's very, very hard to get rid of them, or I'll give you an example, a better example. A lot of people have noticed that over the last 30 years or so, inequality has risen, and a large portion of that inequality can be explained by the phenomenon of assortative mating. So the fact is that because women are working more outside the home and are earning larger salaries, a lot more top incomes than used to be the case are in fact women. Now, that's probably all to the good, but one of the consequences of this is that men who would have, quote-unquote, married down in income, perhaps they would have married their secretaries or a teacher or a nurse, male CEOs are now marrying women CEOs or are marrying high-powered women attorneys, and what that does is that creates more of a concentration of income as two high-income people pair off, creating even larger incomes for themselves and for their children, whereas before some of that wealth would have been redistributed as somebody of a lower income would have married someone with a higher income, and then that would have created a sort of more average distribution. So now it seems to be that rich people are marrying rich people, poor people are marrying poor people, and that's exacerbated inequality in society. Now, because those inequalities seem to be at least in part the result of people's individual choices, I don't know that Rawls would see these as objectionable, right? After all, who you marry is part of the first principle, right? Equal liberty. And it's not clear that society really has much to say about that, except in as much as it affects the prospects of the children, right? So Rawls might still favor inheritance taxes, but it's not clear that he needs to be wedded to the idea of progressively redistributing income from high-powered couples, in as much as those inequalities seem to largely be the product of their free choice. Okay, assuming that they are, of course. So this whole question about how to distribute the gains from social cooperation, the surplus created by social cooperation, this is called distributive justice. This is the topic of distributive justice. How does society, and again I put society in quotes here because of course society doesn't physically act, right? I mean, government acts perhaps, or particular government officials act, but society is a kind of reification. But let's just talk simply, right? How does society distribute the burdens of and the benefits of social cooperation? Well, one way it does this is through taxes and regulation. This is largely what the government does, and it also does through society and culture, right? So the private sector, including good things like distribution according to marginal productivity. So markets are fairly good at rewarding people who are productive, but also bad things like racism will be, part of sort of private sector distribution of burdens and benefits of social cooperation. And all of these are going to be, for Rawls at least, appropriate subjects of distributive justice, as long as, of course, government interference is going to actually remedy the situation, right? So the government can regulate both itself and society and culture for Rawls, as long as it does so in a helpful way. So it means that, just about everything is a candidate for social regulation in Rawls, which makes him very different from someone like Mill, who sees a sharp distinction between public and private spheres of action. Okay, I realize this was a rather long lecture on Rawls, but he's a rather interesting guy and has rather a lot to talk about, and there's a lot that I haven't talked about. So I'll stand by for further questions, and otherwise, just let me know if you have any.